Now we look forward to hearing Archdeacon Lawrence Cross, who is senior lecturer in the subfaculty of theology at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. He has been the highly successful organizer of a major congress in Melbourne in January this year on prayer and spirituality. And he's now working on the next Congress, which is to be in 2002. Among other things, he's author of Eastern Christianity, the Byzantine Tradition, of which a new edition has just appeared, and it is available outside. I hope, Archdeacon Lawrence, you will forgive me if I recall in your first edition mentioning a work by my humble self. You, not unjustly, described it as an old war horse that's beginning to show its age. So when I looked at the new edition of your work, I was very disappointed to find that this description wasn't there anymore. As I rather liked the idea of myself as an old war horse. But you were kind enough to refer to an updated version. But as the book was written 35 years and more ago, indeed, you need to look at the teeth of your war horses to see how old they're getting. So, we shall be listening now to Eastern Christian historical understanding of the Theotokos in text, icon, and liturgy. Archdeacon Lawrence.
Most Reverend Hierarchs, Fathers, Deacons in Christ, and brothers and sisters in Christ, you would agree with me that it would be extremely foolish of me to try and engage in the Bishop in those last remarks. I just leave that. I don't think I really said warhorse, but we'll check. Anyway, however, Bishop Callistus has everything to do with the presentation today. He may not realise that. He had a nightmarish vision of St. Cyril. I had a nightmarish vision, God forgive me, of Bishop Callistus. In that you will remember last year he regaled us with horrific stories of things that could happen to people who dared to use slides. People whose slides jammed but yet continued to give the lecture as if the slides were still showing. Others who the slides were totally out of order and were attempting to describe Grecian draperies, and in fact in the slide was a large toe. And I'm afraid my nerve failed to be in Rome. I was being pursued by Bishop Callistus' predictions, and I changed all the slides that I had prepared to overheads. So I hope the definition won't be as good, but if they had jammed, it would be a catastrophe. The other thing I have to say too, that this lecture comes to you courtesy of the Italian police, in that whilst in Rome in the last few months, I was returning from the Orientale library on my way back to join the family after lunch, and I decided to have a pizza in our local pizza shop where we had got to know the proprietors. I put my bag down against the wall, and to my horror, at the end of munching my pizza and having my little beer, it was gone. I went home, I cried, because there were 2 months' worth of research in that, including the paper for this conference. I then spent most of the afternoon with my small son at the Questura for foreigners of the Carabinieri, whom my children affectionately call the cats and canaries. The Italians have even worse descriptions. But to my amazement, it was found at 7 o'clock that night and returned by a very courteous and beautifully dressed policeman. And after signing many forms, I found that the talk was gone, plus many other notes. It had been rifled right through, but thank God the articles upon which this talk is based were still there. So it's a little bit bitsy, but I hope you won't notice the patches and the joins. So if you'll pardon me, I hope if I repeat one or two things that other speakers have dealt with so well, but I will try to keep my remarks on the early Christian period as brief as possible, because Father Taft has already covered that. However, there is one little set of remarks I would like to make on John's Gospel. So anyhow, we'll try to reduce repetition. But let me tell you in advance what I propose to cover. First, we'll say something about the evidences for devotion and theological meditation upon Mary in the post-apostolic church, and I'll try to choose those elements which endure to be incorporated into what I think is the quite special and unique Eastern Christian approach to Mary. Obviously there are common foundations, but there are some that are particularly used by the East. Next, we must have a look at the certainties and the uncertainties of the early fathers. I would disagree a little with Father Taft, but I'm sorry he's not here to disagree back again, but about the fathers. In fact, some of them were a little less sure than maybe we would like to pretend about Mary, and in the period, say, from Irenaeus to Cyril. And next we must account for the impact of the great Third Ecumenical Council in Ephesus in 331. And following that, I want to have a look briefly at 4 powerful influences whom I believe laid the foundations of the distinctly Eastern approach to Mary, the Mother of God. And at that point, we might feed our visual imagination upon a selection of mostly icons of the Annunciation to see how text and art come together to be an expression of tradition, expressed in the liturgy. We will then stay with the visual and examine the way in which a particular feast entered the liturgical life of the Church. In this case, the Feast of the Protection of the Mother of God, or Pokrof, in order to pinpoint more precisely the essence of the Eastern Christian approach to Our Lady. And if there's any time left, I would like to say something about the approach to Mary of a cluster of theologians associated with Gregory Palamas. And that group, I believe, rounds out the Eastern teaching on Mary. And if there's time, we might say something about modern Russian sophiologists, but then again, that's a theological quicksand, and if I can avoid it, I will. Finally, we might also see how perhaps an Eastern Christian understanding of the Theotokos can be a helpful and healthful thing for modern Western Christians. First, I was trained by Protestants largely in the University of Sydney in my biblical studies. We didn't talk about Mary very much. However, the texts have been well dealt with last night, but there is one that I'd like to draw attention to, and that is the crucifixion and the giving of the mother of Jesus to the beloved disciple in John's Gospel. And I'm largely using an article by my ex-boss, who has just come to this university as New Testament professor, Francis Maloney. Francis is not given to exaggeration ever, but he says in his work on John's Gospel in Pagina Sacra, he says, as a result of the lifting up of Jesus on the cross, the mother and the disciple become one. The disciple leads the mother, eis ta idia. The situation described in the prologue of the Gospel, when the word became eis ta idia, but was not received, has been reversed. He goes on to say, because of the cross and from the moment of the cross, a new family of Jesus has been created. And then, this is the point I think that Maloney makes as a very balanced and sober biblical scholar. He says, despite exaggerated Mariological claims in the past, there can be no avoiding the fact that at the cross, and because of the cross, the crucified Jesus has established a new family. And then within the space of 3 verses, from 25 to 27, the expression mother appears no less than 5 times. He says, this passage cannot simply mean that the beloved disciple is being charged with the widowhood of the mother of Jesus. Instead, it affirms the maternal role of the mother of Jesus in the new family that Jesus has established at his cross. I think that needs some emphasis, because the thing I choose to emphasise there is family, and particularly mother. Now, enough with the Bible. In the post-apostolic church in particular, it's a particularly tricky thing to discuss because of the nature and the state of the sources. For me, the apostolic and post-apostolic worlds always, bring to mind lightning storms on a dark Roman night. Through the occasional sources, we get something like lightning flashes, and we have to be very quick to see what we have seen, if you take my metaphor. Consequently, it's dangerous to generalise, because we sometimes don't get the whole landscape in that lightning flash. However, although they are few, I think that there are some very strong evidences for popular devotion to Mary as the Mother of God at a strikingly early time. And Father Taft agreed last night, not disputing the period or the timing for the book of James, and certainly, including the so-called Apocrypha as valuable sources for the life of the early church. In any case, the earliest and sustained comment on Mary and her importance comes, and this is our first slide, Nesta, please, comes in Justin's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. Justin, as you know, a converted philosopher, died around 165, and he is the first person to make a parallel between Eve and Mary. You see it on the wall. He became man by means of the Virgin, so that by the same means in which disobedience caused by the servants first occurred, by this same way should it also receive its destruction. I choose that passage and emphasise it because the Mary-Eve parallel becomes, for want of a better phrase, a leitmotif that runs all the way through that Eastern Christian approach. It becomes an important ingredient. Now we note this approach of Justin because this theme reverberates throughout homily and hymn and liturgy and sacred art in all the Eastern churches. I won't say too much about liturgy because the expert on that spoke last night, but if there's time we might even sample some texts. My favourite one is from the Ethiopic liturgy, but we'll see. Remember, Eve was the mother of all the living. Mary then is also the mother of all the living, a theme which develops throughout Eastern Christian thought to reach its high watermark in the 14th century in the school of Gregory Palamas, or such I believe. That's to go too far ahead. Let us simply note the Eve-Mary parallel from the 2nd century onwards. There is also evidence that Christians regarded Mary as an intercessor. This fragment of a papyrus from the 3rd century provides two pieces of intriguing evidence. It's the first text to use the title Theotokos, God-bearer. It's in the vocative and it's there. Now, I'm no paleographer, and it's very hard to see in such a lousy reproduction, but there is the first time that has been used. Used not in the vocative, its first occurrence, as far as we know, is in the writings of Alexander of Alexandria, but we'll come to that in a minute. This papyrus is fascinating. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, and as I said, it contains the first use of the title Theotokos, God-bearer, and secondly, it's clearly the ancestor of what will become one of the most famous hymns of the Latin Church, Sub tuum praesidium confugimus, Sancta Dei Genitrix. Remember, we used to sing it at school with great gusto during May, mistakenly in the wrong month, according to Bob Taft. Anyway, the text of it follows. This is, in fact, the text of the papyrus. You realise, of course, it is the clear ancestor. Under your mercy we take refuge, O Mother of God, Theotokos. Do not reject our supplications in necessity, but deliver us from danger. You alone, chaste, alone, blessed. So, where have we got to by the end of the apostolic period? Mary is the new Eve, and the Christian can go to her for delivery from danger. By the way, the authority on that text says it's no later than 200, so it's late 2nd century. Some would argue, well, that these are pieces of evidence, well, they're like single trees, do they argue for a forest? Well, I think they do. The survival of these evidences do in fact argue for the one-time existence of a forest. Unfortunately, the ravages of history and other things have sometimes make our attempt to reconstruct that ancient world difficult, but I think those evidences speak for themselves. The next piece of evidence from that period, which is again much earlier than people imagine, is after Justin and the John Rylands papyrus, is the so-called Protevangelion of the Book of James. Now, this is an apocryphal work which many of us use as a word to damn something as if it's of no value. And it purports to give us details of the early life of the Virgin. Now, Bob Taft has covered that, so I won't go over the fact that it isn't necessarily an historical life or a biography. But this text is extremely important for lots of reasons. One is that its critical editor, De Stryker, proved it to be written no later than 200. And what does it tell us? And why is it important? Well, it shows us the developed Marian piety of the age. But most of all, it gives an account of Mary's presentation and life in the temple in some detail, and as Father Taft explained last night, it parallels many elements in the life of Jesus himself. A strong identification of his mother with the divine Word incarnate. Now, the effects of this upon doctrinal development in the East were far-reaching, raising the question of the nature of Mary's holiness and releasing a flood of homiletic literature on these themes. It had little impact in the West, but you'll see that it starts to come into play in the in the Eastern Church, rather, in art, certainly from the 5th century. Now, perversely, that was the text. So we might just go back a little bit, and it's just that last one. In the story of the Protevangelion, here I pulled out just some little bits. The priest receives Mary in the temple, he kisses her and blesses her with a prayer rather like that of Elizabeth. Mary then is in the temple and she's nurtured by a dove, and then she's chosen from all the daughters of Israel and given a Davidic ancestry, and to weave the purple, the scarlet and true purple veil for the temple. That's enough. We might then just whiz forward to one of the masterworks in Byzantine art, very late, I know it's late, but from the Paleologue period from Constantinople. It's from the Church of Our Saviour in the Fields, so San Saviour in Chora. And here is a masterly rendering of it. Here is the Annunciation to Anne. Keep going this fairly quickly if you would. Here, the birth of Our Lady and being washed by the midwife. You'll notice, by the way, that at the door peeking in is a fairly shy Joachim. It's reminiscent of the icons of a fairly shy Joseph too as well. I didn't give you the text, but in the Protevangelion, it's almost inferred that Mary is conceived by divine power rather than by human agency. Joachim, injured by the reproaches of his fellow Jews, goes into the wilderness. And while he's in the wilderness for a long, long time, Anne becomes pregnant. The question is it not by him? And so, again, the Protevangelion gives rise to the idea of Mary as being God-begotten, which will appear in later Byzantine fathers. Here, the little Mary takes her first steps. I love this one because it has a certain tenderness in it. And I also love the drapery over the servant girl, quite marvellous. But the little Mary takes her first steps towards her mother Anne. Here, again, something which has got almost a playful tenderness too. She's a little child, she's a real human being, and she doesn't want to leave her mother, and in a certain way she almost has to be tricked into going to the temple. And so here are women, virgins, carrying lights, and it's by attracting the little one with the lights that they lead her to her destiny, to the temple. Thanks. She follows them, and comes then to the priest. And here is a presentation then, of course, paralleling that of Christ in the temple. Behind her, her parents, Joachim and Anne. Above, and icons often do this, as you know, something else is imposed upon it. And there is the little Mary in the temple being fed by the angel, nurtured like a dove, as the text of the Protevangelion says. Here, the priest places his hand upon Mary's head, holding his staff, and blesses her. We've already noticed that text, reminiscent of that blessing of Simeon. And here, the same priest who blessed Mary is holding in his hand the scarlet and purple wool, which is given to Mary to weave for the new curtain of the temple, the new curtain for the Holy of Holies. The next slide shows the first, I suppose it's the first Annunciation in some ways. This time we see Mary at the well. She doesn't, in the Protevangelion, she doesn't actually see the angel in this one. And you can see she's sort of looking up, but not at the angel necessarily. She hears a voice hailing her at the well. It's only when she goes inside, and it says quite specifically, but I don't have a slide of this, that when she went inside, troubled by this voice, she sat down and she took up the purple silk and began to spin it. And it's then that the angel appears to her. Thanks. So, why is this important? The reason is that, of course, it overflows into portrayals of the Annunciation, much, much later ones. And you see how the Protevangelion becomes very important artistically. And it starts to take on I think, a strong theological meaning as well. Notice in Mary's hand, just here, there, she's holding the purple, and the thread runs up into her other hand. See? Thanks, mister. I'll give you a whole selection of them now. We'll go fairly quickly. Again, here, by the way, is in these marvellous, this is a bit off the point, but I couldn't resist it, these wonderful gestures of the angel and Mary. It's almost in visual form, how can it be? Thank you. Mary's question, how is this possible? Then this famous icon from Oxford, there in her hand again is the true scarlet and purple. It's there in this black and white, which is just a bit of a ring-in, really. This is a mosaic from Constantinople. Again, see, once more in Mary's hand, the red and purple silk. And in this black and white, you can see quite clearly here. This time it's a thread. That's an icon, I think, which is on Mount Athos now. I just have to check the notes for that, but it's probably not all that important. Let me see. Yes, it's a detail, George Mitrofanich from 1621. Okay. And here we come to a Western one in Santa Maria Maggiore. This is later in the 13th century. There is no purple anymore. It's in some ways that suggestion from the Protevangelion in Western art has disappeared. But it is there in an earlier layer in Santa Maria Maggiore. We'll come to that later. Thanks, Nestor. The next one, please. Okay, so the Protevangelion is a point of departure and a difference, I suppose, between East and West. I wouldn't want to make too much of it, but Western homilists and theologians declined to use it in the patristic period. They seem to have other kinds of concerns. For example, St. Augustine of Hippo is always very sober. He has never invoked Mary. Certainly he praised her fulsomely, but in his work we find no invocation of her. As I said, there seem to be different concerns. Mary seems of most interest to people such as Ambrose and Jerome for her virginity. In late medieval times, the Protevangelion had some influence on the development in the West, but in that early period it seems to have been neglected. However, back to the early fathers. Despite this, where are we? Oh, we can just leave that one for a tick. We're a bit ahead of ourselves. The early fathers, however, despite the evidence I've just given you, also had to work things out. And, for example, on the question of Mary's holiness, some of them had their problems. For example, Irenaeus did think that Mary's was rather pushy, perhaps, and showed untimely haste at Cana in Galilee. Origen was worried. He seemed to detect doubt at the oracle of Simeon. Chrysostom even spoke of failings in the Virgin Mary, and even Cyril spoke of the shipwreck of her faith on Calvary. So that I think it's more to do with their exegetical approach than anything else. I mean, they firmly believe in Mary's holiness, but what I suppose they're picking up is, and trying to account for, is her common human nature. She has the same instincts, of course, and feelings as anyone else. So, however, it's the first person to call Mary Theotokos straight out, as I said before, was Alexander of Alexandria, St. Athanasius' bishop, and the first person to lock horns with the heretic Arius. And with Bishop Alexander, the Patriarch of Alexandria, we are in the flow of the great Christological controversies which shook the Church from 318, roughly, to 451 and beyond. And to this point, East and West on the question of Mary are more or less doing developing along the same lines, though I think it's fair to say the East is doing most of the theological running. Okay, so next we should have a look at, I suppose, the matter that brings the question of Mary in a Christological context to a head. And of course that's the Great Council of Ephesus. We don't need a detailed account of Ephesus, but on the board is a passage from the famous sermon of Proclus, later Patriarch of Constantinople, delivered in the presence of the Patriarch Nestorius on the 23rd of December in 428. And a quick glance through that, you've had time to look at it certainly, will show you that it was almost designed to provoke the reaction that it got from the Patriarch, whose temperament, it would seem, was never the easiest to deal with anyway. Proclus ends with, "Behold an exact description of the Holy Theotokos Mary." But we have to underline the point that Ephesus is not to do with Mariolatry. He insists on Theotokos because of its Christological significance. Nestorius and his party also understood that. What was at issue was certainly not greater or lesser devotion to Mary, though indeed greater devotion did occur because of the council, but the real issue was the unity of the person of Christ. And so either during or immediately after the council, St. Cyril preached what, next one, thanks, Nesta, what, oh, hang on just a second, the bottom there. At the bottom, Proclus also uses that phrase, "If the word had not dwelt in the womb, the flesh would not have sat down upon the holy throne." In that, of course, you can hear the echoes of Athanasius of Alexandria, very much so. Thank you. So sometime during or immediately after the council, St. Cyril also preached what Father Quaston called the most famous Marian sermon of antiquity. Here's a little bit from it. In it, he calls Mary Theotokos, venerable jewel of the whole earth, never extinguished lamp, crown of virginity, sceptre of orthodoxy, never destroyed sanctuary, vessel of the incomprehensible, mother and virgin. And in saying this, he introduces, or he highlights perhaps, the pivotal idea or the pivotal fact upon which the whole Marian approach of the East rests. He called her sceptre of orthodoxy, which means that Cyril and his council declared that one of the essential criteria for a true conception of Christ is the place given to Mary in that Christology. There is to be no theological quibbling here. As Elizabeth Briere has pointed out, and Bishop Carlister said this just the other day, this is literally a matter of life and death because it's a matter of salvation. Because being a Christological question, it goes beyond theory and it touches the whole question of salvation. And as St. Gregory the theologian and Athanasius, I pointed his text out before, the text influenced by him before, have said, any aspect of humanity that is not assumed by God incarnate has not been healed by him. And so, again, to quote Proclus, if the word had not dwelt in a womb, the flesh would not have sat down upon the holy throne. So the Feast of the Annunciation, because it celebrates the Virgin's divine motherhood, is also the feast of Christ's humanity, the Feast of the Incarnation. And this insight has entered deeply within Eastern Christianity and is particularly evident in the liturgical text for the Annunciation, the feast of that divine humanity. On that day, the Church sings, "For in you the whole fullness of Godhead has come to dwell bodily. Because of this, there is nothing proper to human life in which God has not participated. Therefore, mankind is saved in Christ's fullness." Wonderful stuff. So Ephesus and Cyril
protect and express the divine saving actions that have come to pass through Mary. As St. Cyril says, through her the Holy Trinity is adored on earth, the heavens and angels are gladdened, demons chased, that is, chased away, the devil cast down from heaven, fallen man restored, and all creation comes to know the truth. But only in virtue of her motherhood. Again, that an element in Father Taft's talk. It's because of her motherhood, not a personal attribute, but her motherhood. Cyril says, through you, the only begotten Son of God, has shone forth as light. The real cause of all is Christ. Yet she was indeed the instrument through which this happened. And so this is another essential element in the Eastern Christian view, which will reach its apogee in the Palamite school. Now, I just selected 3 icons just for fun because I think in some ways they express the common tradition of East and West in the post-Ephesine period. This rather lovely one, Mary is surrounded by guards or a retinue precisely because in some ways, and I suppose there's a little bit, I'm agreeing it rather with Grabar here, because like the Queen Mother, she holds her royal son upon her lap, and she's given in art a retinue, emphasising divinity and royalty. This is late, of course, this is late medieval, but nevertheless it's a revival of both the old lost Roman mosaic techniques, but it also is a recapitulation of patristic theology in the 13th century. The enthronement of the Virgin Mary in heaven from Santa Maria in Trastevere. And this, again, one which is most famous for us is from Santa Maria Maggiore, the end of the 13th century, or almost the 14th. Okay, that's just something to look at, really. However, one of the in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, there's something which is much old. Oops, hang on. No, we go back. Just one more, if you were. I think I put that in the wrong order. Used that already. Here we are. Thank you. On the triumphal arch, however, in Santa Maria Maggiore, we find this, which is in fact done in 5th century, immediately after the Council of Ephesus, commissioned by Pope Sixtus III. Above, in this register, the Annunciation, the Spirit dove coming down upon Mary. Notice, by the way, this is influenced by the Protevangelion. In her hands, the true scarlet and purple for the weaving of the temple. Below, the adoration of the Magi. Again, Mary, clothed as queen, sits on the right hand of the divine Logos, who has a star to indicate a cross in his halo, rather, seated upon a royal throne. And on this side, a rather mysterious woman, again in a purple. Some authors think that phrase from St. Leo that Father Taft quoted last night, all that Christ was is gone into the sacraments of the Church, it gives us reason to think that this figure here is the Ecclesia ex gentibus, the Church out of the Gentiles. Some people think it's a figure of divine wisdom. In some ways, I really do think that later on we might say that the Virgin and the Church are one. However, Mary and wisdom. So these show us in the immediately after Ephesus the royal dignity that the Council upheld of Mary, her intimate relation to her son, and also the influence of the Protevangelion here as a source. So, that'll do. Next one, please, Nestor, if you would. I'm conscious of time, we have lots to fit in. Now, the foundations laid by those early fathers and by the Council, I think are built upon, in the first instance, by these figures. St. Ephrem the Syrian, but when you actually look at his dates, you'll see, of course, he's maybe the person who influenced everybody else, but that's something we can argue about later. Jacob of Sarouge and St. Romanus and the Acathist hymn. So this 5th century and into the 6th is a very fertile time for thought on the question of Our Lady. The essential elements of the Christian approach to Mary then step off from Ephesus, but they are amplified by this cluster of writers, such as to contribute powerfully to what I would call then a developing Marian culture. And, as ever in the East, it's expressed liturgically. Even though it was Prosper of Aquitaine who made up that phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, it seems to be best honoured in the East. There are 4 major sources then in this patristic cluster, and in chronological order they are as follows. We might have a look at the first one. They're non-Greeks. Maybe there are no Greeks there at all, because we don't really know who wrote the Acathistus. The other 3 are Assyrians. We should, however, note that the most influential of these writers, both for style and theology, Ephraim may in fact be the source of many other things, but his nickname, of course, is the Lyre of the Spirit. And he's... anyhow, I've said that already. What is clear is that he's the most influential liturgical poet of all on Syriac and Byzantine hymnography. And sure enough, he gives great prominence to Justin Martyr's Eve-Mary parallel, which has been drawn some 200 years previously by the, again, Assyrian philosopher Justin. And it fills his work. Ephraim, you can savour those texts as I speak. Ephraim abounds in that parallel and in that contrast. Behold the world, he says, 2 eyes are placed in it. Eve was the blind left eye, the right shining eye is Mary. And basically, I suppose it's a contrast of death and life. Eve gave birth to Cain the murderer, Mary to the life-giver. But Eve, mother of all the living, became the source of death to all living. But Mary, the new branch, took growth from Eve, the old vine, and Christ, the new life, dwelt in her. So I suppose this belief of Ephraim's contains more than a hint of Mary's saving role. And I suppose one of the most important elements for our purposes, for our theme in trying to find the Eastern Christian approach, is that Mary is very much identified with the church in St. Ephrem. He actually uses what might sound like a very, very modern phrase. He actually calls her the symbol of the church. It occurs actually in his hymn on the crucifixion. He calls her symbol of the church, and in the Diatessaron, he declared of Christ that, quote, he freed his church from circumcision and replaced Joshua son of Nun by John, who was a virgin, to whom he entrusted Mary, his church, as Moses entrusted his flock to Joshua. So you see, for Ephraim, without invoking technical or abstract language, the holiness of Jesus and that of his mother are not at all at the same level as other saints or angels. They wouldn't agree with Bob Taft, I don't think. In the Nicene hymns, he writes, you alone and your mother are in all things fair, for there is no flaw in thee and no stain in thy mother. Of these 2 fair ones, to whom are my children similar? And he says also, and I am espoused, for you are chaste. I am handmaid and daughter of blood and water. Yes, she's purchased by Christ's blood, certainly. For you have purchased and baptized me, the Son of the Heavenly One, who came and took up his abode in me, and I became his mother. Now, I know we have to be careful. The holiness of Christ is that of God himself, and Mary is a creature. And Ephraim speaks of her as one baptized in the blood of Christ. But nevertheless, she is the first saved. And without resorting to theories of immaculate conception, he sees her as the first of the elect, whose election is part of the mystery of salvation, of the salvation of all, which has been won by her Son. So it's a funny concept to invoke here, but I think we should modify the view we heard last night with a kind of primacy, at least, given to Mary. The second Syrian to enrich our approach to Mary is Jacob of Sarouj, known as the flute of the Holy Spirit. His ode on the Blessed Virgin condenses the very best insights of the Eastern Church to this point. And it's a work of very deep devotion and spiritual passion. That's the wonderful thing about these texts. They're very passionate and poetic. Like Ephraim before him, he uses the Eve Mary parallel to the fullest, just a tiny touch. The child who stretched out her hand to her prostrate ancestress and raised her up. The daughter who wove a garment of glory and gave it to her father Adam, so that he might cover himself with it after he had been denuded under the trees. And you know, for example, in our triad, how that theme of Adam outside the garden, naked, alienated, reverberates all through the liturgy. And again he says, along with his countryman Ephraim, how could I paint the picture of this marvellous, beautiful one with ordinary colours? Too exalted and too glorious is the image of her beauty. Well, Jacob, however, is interesting for us from another reason, because he also allows us to pinpoint one of the, well, it's a real difference, whether it's a serious difference between East and West. In that he stresses Mary's perfect purity, and he would affirm that there remained in her daily the unblemished nature of a human being with a will directed towards the good. And he also affirms the virginity of her body and the sanctity of her soul. And he says she was wise and filled with the love of God. But he doesn't resort to, say, a theory of Immaculate Conception. And he has, like the other Eastern Fathers, he has a different idea of what original sin is. For the East, the most important thing about original sin is mortality, death. For the Western Fathers, it's different. And so Jacob, because of his a different approach to man's aboriginal predicament, believes that Mary, through her own merit, reached a certain step of perfection. It sounds a bit Pelagian, doesn't it? But it's, you know, he said, God examined her how far she was above and free from all evil. No movement towards bad desires arose in her, nor any thought exciting sensual pleasure. The love of the world did not burn in her. She did not occupy herself with puerilities. And then he says, at the Annunciation, something different happened. Then she was freed from original sin. And he says explicitly that Mary was purified like John the Baptist, or John the Evangelist, or Elijah, or Melchizedek. And it seems that he assumed a kind of twofold purity in Mary. One which was reached by nature, and the other merited, as it were, by the former, given to her at the Annunciation, as the final preparation for her divine motherhood. So, I seem to have lost a page there, but make things shorter, won't it? The next source we might turn to is the Archdeacon. Now, we've recited it devoutly the other evening, so I don't have to say all that much about it. But it also is a document influenced by apocryphal sources. For example, there's some influence of the apocryphal Matthew in it. Remember when we were talking about the idols falling down when Mary and the Holy Family went to Egypt, fleeing from Herod, and that story comes from an apocryphal source. Let's see. The Archdeacon very much emphasises that the powers which belong to Mary, which strictly belong to God, but because Mary is Theotokos, mother of the Creator, she in a sense dispenses those. Let me see. The other thing I suppose we should say at this point too is we should be careful of language. And Father Taft again touched on this too, in that these are poetic compositions, and they're a genre in themselves. And so those haretismi, those greetings, hail, and the are to be taken, as in some ways are deliberately superlative. However, I wouldn't say that they weren't a source for theology. They most certainly are. But certainly not of a technical kind of theology. There is not much material there for a geometry of the divine, if you know what I mean. But there is certainly for a more heartfelt kind of theology. So, as far as we can tell, the hymn was composed for the Feast of the Annunciation, and it continued even after the composition of Kontakia was abandoned in the 8th century, and it's been of a huge influence in the East, and it also, by the way, has influenced the West as well, and it's been one of the principal vehicles for the transmission of many of these Eastern ideas to the West. As far as we can tell, it wasn't composed for the siege of 626, we think it is. Rather, it probably had a preface added, which gives that impression. And some of the things, the most impressive things that come from it are that Mary is the reconciliation of many sinners. She's called the stole of those stripped of the right to appeal, the one who's paid the ransom for transgression, the gate of salvation, who has begotten anew those who were born in sin. The samples are on the board. What more can we say? Except perhaps a light note at this point. You remember, of course, that all the constantly throughout the hymn we have the phrase, "O bride, yet a maiden." Yes, yeah. One of a very cultured Greek friend of mine years ago in Australia told me a story. He was from Alexandria, and he told me a story of a devout priest who was trying to put the akathist into English. And he imagined that somehow or other you could do the same trick with a prefix from Greek. You could say, "O bride, yet not a bride," but by just using a prefix as you can do in Greek. Nymphi anymphete. So they managed to just catch it before it went to press, because Father, who spoke very good English, had made a little mistake. He missed the nuance that you couldn't say, "O bride unbridled." Yeah. So, on a light note, we should turn to Romanos. Romanos is the third Syrian, and called the Melod, the hymn writer, the musician. Mary, for him, is not only the very human mother of Jesus. The strongest thing in his hymnography is that she is the mighty intercessor for all humanity. And here he strikes a note which we've seen in the earliest text, but amplifies it powerfully. She has shown man the right way, according to Romanos, and at the last judgment he prays as follows: "Through the prayers of the ever-virgin Theotokos, spare me." In the beautiful poem on the Nativity, Mary herself affirms her universal motherhood. I've put some of it on the overhead. She says to her son, "I am not simply your mother, but for all men I beseech you. You have made me the mouth and the glory of my whole race. In me, your world has a mighty protectress, a wall and a support. The exiles from the paradise of delights look to me." Again, another quotation from Romanos, which includes some of that. "Cease lamentations. I shall become your advocate with my son. Put away sadness, because I have brought joy into the world. For it is to overcome the realm of sorrow that I have come full of grace." Lovely, isn't it? And then to the Magi, on behalf of the Magi to Christ, she again speaks that text which we've already seen. Those fathers consolidate the tradition, and you can see the themes building. Perhaps we might just then turn to see how this manifests itself in a particular in the genesis of a particular feast. Here is an icon you're probably all familiar with, the Feast of Our Lady's Protection, which illustrates an event which may or may not have happened in Constantinople in a century we cannot pinpoint. Nevertheless, the literary source for this feast of the veil, or the protection of the Mother of God, is the 1st of October. And at the source of it is the Greek life of St. Andrew the Fool. And it was translated into Slavonic and is extremely popular with the Slavs, and it seemed to have slipped into oblivion amongst the Greeks until recently. Because although the story is about the saving of Constantinople, there are only, as far as I know, Slav examples of this icon, and they really took it to themselves and made the 1st of October its feast. It's now in the Greek Synaxarion, but later on October 28th. Now, anyway, let's see. Further on this question of the Feast of the Pokrov, the story of Andrew the Fool's vision, let me see, tells how the Mother of God, with her veil, prays for the city of Constantinople, and it occurs in the chapel at Blachernae, where her veil and her girdle had been preserved from the time of the Emperor Leo the First in the 5th century. Now the person, let me see, the person that Andrew the Fool is talking to here, there's Andrew. Andrew is a kind of a Constantinopolitan holy bag person. He lived on the streets. They said he drank his water from puddles, and he lived rough. But yet somehow or other he had this noble patron, Epiphanius, who stands alongside him here. And Andrew is almost touching the cloud upon which Mary seems to stand, pointing out to his disciple Epiphanius this vision. Epiphanius also is said to have seen it. I'll read you the story straight out. When a night-long doxology was held in the Holy Saurus at Blachernae, the blessed Andreas was there, behaving in his usual way. Golly. Epiphanius was also there, and with him one of his servants. At the 4th hour of the night, the blessed Andreas, who used to stand as long as his zeal gave him strength, sometimes until midnight, sometimes until morning, saw the most holy Mother of God appearing visibly, very tall, from the royal doors. You can take us through some. There's a few here. Maybe just go slowly. She was escorted by an awe-inspiring retinue, amongst which there were, amongst others, the Honourable Forerunner and the Son of Thunder, holding her by the hand on both sides. Many other holy men in white garments accompanied her. As she approached the ambo, the blessed man went up to Epiphanius and said, "Do you see the lady and mistress of the world?" And he answered, "Yes, I do, my spiritual father." Before their eyes, she knelt and she prayed for a long while, besprinkling with tears her godlike and immaculate face. Having finished her prayer, she went into the sanctuary and prayed there for the people standing about. As she prayed, she removed with beautiful dignity the veil that she had on her immaculate head, appearing like a flash of lightning, and spread it. It was large and awe-inspiring, with her immaculate hands over all the people that were standing there. For a long time, the admirable men saw it stretched out over the congregation, radiating the glory of God like electrum. As long as the most holy Mother of God was there, the veil was also visible. But when she had withdrawn, they could no longer see it. Now, no doubt she had taken it away with her, but her favour she left to those who were there. So the Feast of the Pokrov was apparently first introduced amongst the Slavs by Andrei Bogolyubsky in Vladimir in the second half of the 12th century. At least so Ryden says. He's the authority on the life of Andrew. And the reason why St. Romanos appears in so many of the icons is simply that the 1st of October, the date of the Russian Feast of the Pokrov, is also the Feast of St. Romanos. In other words, he wasn't there when this vision occurred. And as in his own icon, St. Romanos is often depicted as singing from the ambo of a church the Kontakion of the Nativity, his first Kontakion, which was also revealed to him miraculously by the Mother of God. And so that fits very well with the Pokrov, and so he's included in it. There's also a brief account of the icon, if you're interested further, in Uspensky and Losky's famous book on the meaning of icons. But what we want to say, I suppose, is that in this icon, in some ways, a whole lot of themes come together. We should ask ourselves, well, what is this veil that she spreads over the people of God to protect them? We've seen the red wool and the red skein before, the veil of the temple. It's both veil of the temple, but it's her veil. And when we put ourselves back, of course, into the ancient world to say, well, who wears a veil? The answer is a married woman wears a veil. In the Roman world, to take the veil meant to be married, not to become a nun. So when Mary takes off her veil, it's the veil of her as a married woman, the veil of her motherhood, and it's with her motherhood that she protects her people. So in the plastic arts, if you like, express that basic theological foundation of Eastern Christian approach to Mary, that she's our protectress because she is God's mother. So as bride of Christ and mother of God, she represents the whole body of the living church. And it was her determination, I suppose, to accept the action of the Holy Spirit within her body and to hear Christ, that which was interpreted symbolically by the fathers, as each Christian's reception of the Holy Spirit in baptism. There we return to that theme from last night. Certainly we're asked to emulate her behaviour, but I believe that the Feast of the Pokrov shows that her role is indeed at a level of primacy above yours and mine. I don't know what other word to use. Can I give you a modern example of how this appears, for example, in the preaching of the modern Orthodox Church, or the comparatively modern Orthodox Church? 100 years ago, approximately, in 1884, Archbishop Dmitry Muratov preached a sermon in Russia entitled "Rejoice Our Joy." And he said that of Mary, that she is the joy of the whole world. And by the way, of course, it's for the feast of the Pokrov, for Our Lady's protection. He says she is mother, or again, underline it, by grace of rebirth. She is their protection, that is Christians. She is the protection of Christians and the guardian of all Christians from evil by the glory, power and might granted her. And he then says that all Christians need to seek spiritual joy, which alone can truly and effectively comfort us in any sorrow. The one source of pure and holy joy in the Lord is the all-holy and life-giving Spirit, the Comforter. But then he says, but first of all, one must take care to win and preserve in oneself the grace of the all-holy Spirit of God and be united in one spirit with the Lord Jesus Christ. And the giver of this pure and holy joy, wait for it, the giver of this pure and holy joy in the Lord is the most holy Mother of God. This is radical, and it would annoy some Christians from other traditions. But it's on the line. She, as the life-receiving and life-bearing source, is the first receiver, capital R, of the grace proceeding from God's throne, and the first giver of this grace to all believers who pray and ask. I don't like words from the Latin language that end in RIX particularly. Grate on my ears, but it's very close to being a theology of a mediatrix of grace. 100 years later, Patriarch Pimen, the late Patriarch of Moscow, on the 14th of October, which of course any right person knows is really the 1st of October, we're all calendarists in Melbourne, yes, preached this to the Academy of the Moscow Theological School on the Feast of Pokrov. He says to his intending clergy, your lives should be built wholly by you in the light of that marvellous fact, that wonderful reality which is being witnessed today by the Church, that upon entering the house of God and conducting divine service, you are entering into a prayerful, living, close and real communion with the Mother of God, that beside you stands the Virgin Mary, quote, above heaven and purer than the sun's light. That's Cyril. Before the throne of God. She is the spiritual mother of all those for whom the pastor is the spiritual father. And he finishes, looking at the face of the Most Holy Mother of God, learn from her how to love the people of God actively and vitally, observing and entering into the lives of your future flocks. There it washes up on the shore of modern preaching. I believe the source of that is Palamite, and to do perhaps with the Palamite revival. But Vladika, we might have run out of time, or they all might be exhausted. But we might just come to the end of those Pokrov icons, Nestor, if you would. On the table over there is a related mystery. Oh, so this is important. This is one of the earliest ones, and it's quite different. It's from the gates at the holy doors of the Cathedral of Suzdal. It's also a Pokrov icon. You might just drop it down a bit, Nestor, if you'd be so kind, would you? See, now Our Lady's veil is held here by angels, as it is in the rather more elaborate hieratically constructed icons. And above here, I'm sorry it's such a lousy reproduction, but above here is Christ with his hand in blessing. See? So, in other words, Mary's veil, her motherhood protects the church, but it is Christ's power, Christ's blessing, which is given to the church through her. And the icons on the table, which you might like to look at on the way out, are 3 icons, all Russian, of the feast of Our Lady's title, Joy of All Sufferers. In this one, as it happens, you see her standing alone. She's not holding a baby, but her son is above her in every one of them. And the icons represent the prayers of the faithful going to Christ through her, and grace being received from Christ through her. I believe these 2 feasts, very much speak to one another. And both of them are immensely popular in our Russian tradition. Now, there might be some time to say something about Palamas, but maybe I just say one little thing about Western, the situation perhaps today and in the modern West. Something maybe it might be useful. I was brought up a Roman Catholic in Sydney, Australia, in what I suppose was almost an Irish parish. I'm deeply grateful for it, but I'm afraid it was a period in which, in some ways, the devotion of the Roman Catholic Church had hit a kind of bathos. So the hymns that we sang to Our Lady were things like "Bring flowers of the rarest, bring flowers of the fairest, and O Mary, we crown thee with blossoms today, Queen of the angels and Queen of the May," and it was content-free. Now, I don't. It's wrong to compare the worst of something with the best of something else. I know that's disastrous ecumenically, and Father Taft warned us about that last night. But in some ways, after the Reformation, and in that maybe it's a wash-up of pietism, in some ways a peculiar kind of insipidity crept into Marian devotion in the West. Let's see. Let me put it this way. In the hymns to Mary, what characterised many of them in the West was a world dark and evil, society is hostile, and the devotee to Mary is somebody steeped in sin, we stand before thy Son, his loving heart upbraids us, the evil we have done. But if thou wilt appease him, speak for us but one word, for thus thou can obtain us the pardon of the Lord. Well, it's sort of Germanus of Constantinople, in some ways. It's a bit forbidding. And when it's not that, it sometimes tends to the sentimental stuff that I just quoted. Now, the Vatican Council opened the door, I think, as I agree with Taft from last night, for the recovery of an image of the Madonna which doesn't maim. But such a Mariology has rather conspicuously failed to materialise. A lot of post-conciliar preaching and writing about Mary has become rather self-defeating in a way. There's a wonderful opportunity, but I wonder whether it's been taken up. Because the most recent treatment of Mary has been rather hortatory and moralistic. Mary is presented to us as a good example, as a model of obedience to God, somebody we should imitate. And I would agree with Eamon Duffy, the Cambridge historian, that any Mariology which is focused primarily on this aspect of Mary's role is doomed from the start. It's far too cerebral and abstract. And so whatever the faults maybe of the old medieval and Reformation Mariologies and their excesses were, they certainly weren't dry. But I think a lot of the modern stuff is rather dry. How can the East help? Well, I think this restatement of Mary's motherhood is very important. You see, the Marian tradition for both churches is rooted in something much more basic, something much more concrete. The simple fact of her childbearing, her motherhood. And this, of course, isn't to suggest that her childbearing was a brutal physical fact, divorced from her free cooperation with the will of God for all mankind. No, certainly not. Christianity can never separate human childbearing from human loving. And we can't separate Mary's womb from her heart and her will. But the Church after Vatican II has in fact been curiously coy about the material fact of Mary's motherhood. In the past, however, the Church has not been coy like that. An example is, let me see, Fra Angelico, for example, the ceremony of carols, the Litany of Loreto in the West, all remind us that the figure of Mary is complex, rich and contradictory, and too rich, too complex and contradictory to be simplified and moralised into banality. And the Eastern Church affirms that. So a Madonna who is primarily an example is as oppressive and dispiriting and as life-denying as any of the projected Madonnas of the past. For example, in Julian of Norwich's Revelations, our Lord did not invite us to contemplate Mary in order to see in her what we must do. Rather, we are invited to see in her how we are loved. And so Christians have never thought of Mary primarily as a good example. Rather, she has been loved as the principal miracle of God's grace and power. And because she is the cause of our joy, she is the cause of our joy. That's her primacy. We must learn again then not to imitate but to celebrate the multiple glories of the Theotokos, the Ark of the Covenant within which the glory of God came to rest, the rose of Sharon upon which the dew of the Godhead descended, the gate of heaven through which the light of life shone on mankind. Christians love the Mother of God not because she sets a standard that they must imitate, but because beyond all desiring and deserving